Every web which falls from these restless looms has a history more or less connected with sin and suffering, beginning with slavery and ending with overwork and premature death. John Greenleaf Whittier.
On a cold, dark Friday afternoon, December 26, 1828, in an outburst of anger, pent-up resentment, and frustration, the women mill workers of Dover, New Hampshire did what no other factory women in the United States had ever done before. The women organized 300 to 400 strong and walked out of the mills. They took to the streets of Dover in the first strike by all women in the country. This single, collective, and organized act of defiance, comprised exclusively of women, would mark the beginning of continuous conflict between labor and management as workers struggled to gain control over their wages and working conditions. The belief that women had rights to fair pay, decent working conditions, and reasonable hours of employment would upset and challenge the established social and cultural norms of the time. Society in New Hampshire and the United States was on the precipice of change. On December 26, 1812, John Wheeler announced in the Dover Sun the first meeting of the
proprietors of the Dover Cotton Factory, to be held at Mrs. Lydia Tebbett's dwelling house in Dover on Tuesday the 19th of January next, at 5 p.m. for the purpose of choosing officers to oversee and govern the affairs of said corporation.
Born were the locally owned and financed cotton textile mills in Dover, New Hampshire. It would take nearly 13 years to construct the mammoth brick structures, some of which remain today along the banks of the Cocheco River in downtown Dover. From the beginning, Dover and industrial manufacturing were a perfect match. The Cocheco River provided adequate water power and an excellent transportation system to and from the ocean for raw materials and manufactured goods. The humid climate, especially in the summer, along with the long hours of sunlight, was perfect for the spinning of cotton and weaving of textiles. The population of Dover and its surrounding towns provided an adequate supply of workers for the mills. The first mills were owned by local businessmen, principals John Williams and Isaac Wendell, and financed by 8 local investors. The employees, who were mostly women, worked long hours, 14 hours a day, 6 days a week. There existed a surplus of women workers in the village and on the neighboring farms. Management believed that women were perfect for the low-skilled jobs and that they would be easier to manage than men. The women could also be hired at wages much lower than what men could be expected to work for. There were very few complaints from the hard-working women who had come from the farms. The work was not strenuous, the pay was very good, and life in the boarding house consisted of clean lodgings and good food. By 1821, the company was so successful it began to expand. Over 100 acres was bought by the Dover Cotton Company with money from out-of-town investors on the Lower Falls in the center of Dover to enlarge their operation. Having no local financial resources available to invest in the construction of new facilities, Agent Williams and his partner Isaac Wendell traveled frequently to Boston in search of wealthy investors for their company. In 1822, with the help of capital from Boston investors, the first brick mill building in downtown Dover, Building No. 2, was constructed. Modeled after the highly successful Waltham, Mass. mill buildings, Building No. 2, 4 stories high, 155 feet long, and 43 feet wide, was a dramatic structure. It permanently altered and dominated the skyline of Dover. Shortly after the construction of Mill Building No. 3, Isaac Wendell left the company to pursue a business deal at the Great Falls Manufacturing Company in Somersworth, New Hampshire. Wendell's business venture would fail in 1826. As construction of the mills transformed Dover and the buildings neared completion, the Dover Cotton Company began to seek out workers for the expanded operations. Labor was the biggest issue that faced the manufacturers. Williams and Wendell, on behalf of the Dover Cotton Company, began to run ads weekly in the newspapers. The technology for the mass production of cotton textiles called the young women from the countryside and their farms to the factories to work for wages in the new and developing urban setting. Between 1823 and 1826, the Dover Cotton Factory would construct 3 more large brick mill buildings in the village center at the Lower Falls. The company reorganized, and the name was changed from the Dover Cotton Factory to the Dover Manufacturing Company. Dover was bustling with the activity of masons laying 60,000 bricks a day. The population of Dover would more than double in 20 years, from just over 2,000 to over 5,000. Development to support the mills was unprecedented, as boarding houses, shops, and businesses were constructed to meet the needs of the rapidly growing population. The Boston investors in the Dover Manufacturing Company would convince John Williams to incorporate a separate new company for the calico printery operations, housed in Mill No. 5. In 1827, the Cocheco Manufacturing Company was incorporated. The new owners of the Cocheco Manufacturing Company were the same men who were already part owners in the Dover Manufacturing Company. The Boston investors had duped Williams. The Cocheco Manufacturing Company would siphon money from the Dover Manufacturing Company until the Dover Manufacturing Company was broke. By 1829, the Boston Associates would purchase all the interests in the financially crippled Dover Manufacturing Company. In the same year, Williams would be fired, and by 1837 he would be bankrupt. With Williams now out of the picture, new agent James Curtis, hired by the Boston investors in 1828, was brought on board to manage the Dover Manufacturing Company. Everything changed, especially for the women workers. Rules once ignored were now fiercely enforced. New rules and severe fines were implemented. Curtis was an ex-Navy captain and a harsh taskmaster. He was more mindful of the bottom line than of his employees, who were mostly women. The new, tighter regulations forbade any talking between employees during working hours, prohibited combinations, unions, imposed a 12.5-cent fine for lateness, and reduced the operatives' wages from 58 cents to 53 cents per day. On December 30, 1828, the women of Dover, New Hampshire took exception to the devaluation of their labor and enforced regulations. They engaged in the first organized effort by women factory workers against mill owners and walked off the job. The women walked out in protest to the reduced wages and new rules, and for the first time an entirely female workforce had organized a public collective labor action. Their premeditated action included music, banners, and gunpowder, all elements common to the working men's protests occurring throughout the region. The scene is described in Josephson's book, The Golden Threads.
They resolved that they would show their mettle. On the Friday afternoon after the fine was announced, between 300 and 400 girls turned out, paraded about the town to strains of maritime music, and burned several casks of gunpowder. The management, not intimidated in the slightest, countered by advertising for several hundred better-behaved women. What could the girls do next? They did not know. On the Monday following, all but those who had been blacklisted returned to work, having accomplished nothing more than laying off a little steam.
Over half the entire workforce participated in this parade. which served as confirmation to the Dover woman's ability to communicate, cooperate, and act collectively. The local newspapers provided very little coverage of the strike, and what coverage they did provide was critical and contradictory.
The Dover Inquirer. Turnout. A general turnout of the girls employed in the cotton factories in this town to the number of 600 or 800 took place on Friday last, on account of some imaginary grievances. It has, we believe, turned out to their cost as well as disgrace, and since that time many of them have returned to their work, and all who are permitted will, without doubt, return in course of a few days. The girls, on leaving the factory yard, formed a procession of nearly half a mile in length, and marched through the town, with martial music, accompanied with the roar of artillery. The whole presented one of the most disgusting scenes ever witnessed. December 30th, 1828.
The Mechanics' Free Press reported on January 17, 1829.
The strike formed the subject of a squib, probably for more than half the newspapers from Maine to Georgia. The circumstance of 300 or 400 girls or women marching out of their factory in a procession and firing off a lot of gunpowder, and the facetious advertisement of the factory agent for 200 or 300 better-behaved women made altogether a comical story quite worth telling.
January 7, 1829. The Philadelphia National Gazette went so far to report that perhaps the militia was needed to stop the insurrection by the women workers.
The late strike and grand public march of the female operatives in New Hampshire exhibit the Yankee sex in a new and unexpected light. By and by, the governor may have to call out the militia to prevent a gynecocracy.
The new rules and wage reductions enacted by the Boston owners of the Dover Manufacturing Company in 1828 were all directed towards the women, including a 10% reduction in pay, the loss of 1/3 of a day's wages for being 15 minutes late, a rule restricting all talking among operatives unless relating to work, rules to prohibit gambling and drinking, and the requirement that 14 days' notice must be given to the employer, and the possible loss of one's work for breaking any of the rules were clearly not imaginary grievances. The enforcement of the rules was at the sole discretion of the supervisor and the overseer. Their authority was absolute. When the fines did not work to keep workers in line, management resorted to dismissal. The overseers and the superintendents had the power to enforce the rules and dismiss the women operatives at their discretion. Actual dismissals for work-related and non-work-related reasons were common in all the mills. Often the threat of being dismissed was enough to keep the workers in check. Management justified the dismissals by claiming that unacceptable behavior made for bad work and bad worker reputations. Workers complained that dismissal was just another instrument to achieve total control over the labor force in order to secure high profits. The key for management was complete and absolute control. The complete and unalterable authority of management to fire workers disturbed many. The workers felt powerless against the often arbitrary enforcement of rules riddled with abuse. Operatives had to obey all the rules or face the consequences, while management could make, change, and enforce them without concern for the workers. At the heart of management's control lay the contracts, which all workers were required to sign. The contracts were legal documents that outlined length of service, boarding house agreements, wages, payment type, and schedule. Workers and their organizations saw the corporations reaching beyond the factory and influencing affairs throughout the city.
We have to contend with almost omnipotent and omnipresent power of corporate monopoly. This controls the city government, the pulpit, the press, everything. The Lowell Union of Associationists, May 1847.
He didn't appreciate these girls wanting to be treated properly and right, which they had a right to be, you know, but they were taken advantage of just because they were a woman.
As restrictive as the contracts were, always favoring management, the ultimate instrument of control, in conjunction with dismissal, was the notorious blacklist. Blacklists were tools used by management to communicate who the troublemakers were in each factory and between manufacturers in neighboring towns. The blacklist was cited according to the Massachusetts Unpassed Senate Papers 1846 as
the cause of much injustice and oppression on the part of the corporations. Its effects were becoming every day more grievous, giving over to the manufacturer great power over the operative and leading to monopoly and wrong.
Management sent letters and documents to neighboring companies listing the troublemakers with regularity. In a correspondence dated September 25, 1828, just 3 months before the strike in Dover, New Hampshire, Matthew Bridge, assistant agent for the Dover Manufacturing Company, writes to his counterpart in the Great Falls Manufacturing Company in Somersworth, New Hampshire. The subtle and careful reference to the blacklist is a premonition of things to come.
I am sorry you have difficulties in your manufacturing department, but with so many people, I suppose we can hardly expect an entire relief from them. Of the person you have named, not one of them is employed in our service to our knowledge, or has made application for that purpose. About a fortnight since, 2 weavers from your place, whose names I do not now recollect, applied for work, but they acknowledged they had not settled properly with you, and were promptly rejected. Matthew Bridge.
Workers felt helpless, caught in the crossfire of blacklist correspondence and dismissal.
I must tell you I'm a factory girl. Tired enough of this slave-like life, seeing no prospect of a reduction in the hours of labor. My education is better than that of factory girls in general. Am fond of books, and must tell you I am turned out for reading in the mill, and my name has gone to all the blacklists kept at the counting rooms. I have no home, and I know not what to do. Anonymous contributor, The Voice of Industry, December 1846.
The blacklist would be used as a tool to control and oppress labor in New Hampshire for the next 30 years. The fear and dread of being blacklisted would ultimately serve as the catalyst for legislation for the 10-hour workday in 1847. Sympathy in some of the press shifted from manufacturers to labor as the conditions in the mills continued to deteriorate. The Dover Inquirer in 1847 featured a story.
They can go where they please. The operatives can go where they please. No restraint is put upon them by the corporations. And if they don't like the work in one place, they can get it in another. Yet such is the fact. Operatives who have refused to sign this special contract, grinding them to work as long as the mills run, have been discharged and blacklisted.
Before the 10-hour workday reform of 1847, the women worked long hours, 12 to 14 hours per day on average. The long hours of work were extended in the winter under artificial lamplight. The factories were first lit up for the winter annually on September 21st, and management blew out the lamps on March 21st, marking the coming of spring and the beginning of long daylight hours. The end of the lighting up was celebrated by blowing out balls, working-class celebrations to mark the onset of spring, with more hours of daylight and an end to work by smoky, dim, artificial light. On March 30th, 1847, the Dover Inquirer reported,
The blowing out picnic at the town hall on Monday evening the 22nd went off with a good degree of pleasure to all that were present.
Management would often try to diminish the impact of the long hours under artificial light by sponsoring festive lighting up balls in September, when the oil lamps were lit to extend the hours of work. The workers despised the lighting up and the long hours of work under artificial lights, while the owners simply viewed it as a necessity to keep production and profits up. The skyline of Dover at night created a visual image of the conflict between labor and management. From the outside, the mills all lit up created a sparkling and magical sight, but the external beauty and magic were illusions, which masked the reality of the horrific and oppressive working conditions within the mill building walls.
One of the most beautiful sights we have ever witnessed. All these factories lighted up for the evening's labor. The brightness of the city beyond, the clear blue sky above, from which the stars were sending down their glittering beams into the glassy waters of the river, all combined to form a spectacle which might almost lead an observer to believe that our hard-working, matter-of-fact city had been transformed into a fairyland. Harriet Farley.
David Zondervan concludes in Aspirations and Anxieties that one of the major reasons factories were said to be so grimy and the air so foul was the large number of candles and oil lamps used to light the interiors for work before sunrise and after sunset. The factories in Dover use small whale oil lamps at each end of the loom to assist weavers in seeing their work after dark.
These lamps gave off only a very dim light, but it was regarded as a great improvement over the candle, especially the slut, which was a whale oil saucer, burned by placing a woolen rag in the oil, with the end over the side of the saucer. Mrs. Burns.
Clean and efficient gas lighting would not be introduced into some factories in Dover until the 1850s. Because the interiors of nearly all the mills, including Dover, were wood-framed, they were susceptible to fires. Author David Zondervan, in Aspirations and Anxieties, describes the hazards facing the workers in explicit detail. The textile mills in particular were filled with flammable materials. Fibers and lint filled the air and stuck to the walls and ceilings. Floors were often oily from machinery lubrication. The machines often overheated and threw off sparks. The artificial lighting inside was usually candles or whale oil lamps. All these factors combined to create serious fire hazards. Sometimes the fires were minor, and sometimes they were major and fatal. Fire meant injury, loss of jobs, death for the women workers.
When the woolen mill at Salmon Falls was destroyed by fire August 7, 1834, there were 15 girls working in the upper room. The fire cut off their escape through the building. One of their number was physically strong and very brave. She told the rest to follow her. She climbed out of the dormer window and with her strong hands turned up the squares of lead fastened where the window and the roof joined. By doing this, she made hand and footholds for the frightened girls. 12 followed her out over the roof. The other two, too timid to climb out, were burned to death. Sarah Huntress.
The lighting up was a season of danger and discomfort, creating ever-growing resentment by the workers for the factory management and system. The women often described feeling like prisoners or slaves working under the dingy artificial light in the dangerous and unhealthy conditions of the mills. As if the conditions in the mill were not challenging enough, the women were subject to a whole new world of time to measure the hours of their labor. Leaving behind the hard work of their farms and the work cycles of the sun and the seasons, the women entered into the mechanized and clock-measured world of the cotton textile factories. The clock and the bells regulated life and work. The pace to keep up with the gigantic pounding machines became intense as factory owners sped up the drives and the shafts and increased the number of looms each woman attended to boost production and profits. Factory clocks were linked closely with the bells, but the clocks were not always put in towers for public display. The timepieces were literally in the hands of managers, and many of the women could not afford their own watches. Tampering with the clocks and then ringing the bells was an abuse that was routinely employed by the managers. Factory time and bell hours could be significantly longer than real time, and it was a customary practice for some companies to add up to half an hour to the workday.
Robbed? Yes, robbed of a part of their time allowed for meals, by moving their hands of the clock backwards or forwards, as would best accomplish that purpose. Seth Luther.
It was not an easy thing for the women to rush home, take their meals, and return to the factory at the beckoning of the bell, all within 30 minutes, especially when some of the women boarded almost half a mile from the mill gates. Daily life was long and it was rushed. Most workers yearned for longer meal times to promote better health and friendlier social relations. Many workers felt that the mill owners wanted their workers to have as little free time to socialize as possible, as an additional way to control the workforce. In later years, the construction of a town clock would break the corporation's monopoly on time. There would be no turning back to the natural rhythms to measure time.
In midwinter, I was awakened at 5 by the bells calling to labor. The time allowed for dressing and breakfast was so short, and then the work at the mill was begun by lamplight. It must be remembered that all of the hours of labor are spent in rooms where oil lamps, together with 40 to 80 persons, are exhausting the healthful principles of air, and where the air is loaded with particles of cotton thrown from thousands of cards, spindles, and looms. Catherine Beecher.
The women workers suffered from frequent respiratory illnesses. Often their working years were cut short by the conditions in the mill. An exhibition catalog from 1977 at the Merrimack Valley Textile Museum in North Andover, Massachusetts, describes the conditions that workers faced in the mills as dangerous and deadly.
Weavers were particularly susceptible to respiratory problems because they had to suck the thread through their shuttles. These kiss-of-death shuttles forced workers to constantly ingest lint, sizing, and dyes from thread. Since the shuttle passed throughout the mill, there was also the risk of transmitting communicable diseases such as tuberculosis.
The smoke-filled rooms, especially in the winter, created great problems for the women. An operative from Manchester observed that
Those who are shut up within the prison walls of a factory were continually inhaling cotton dust, lamp smoke, and away from wholesome, pure air.
A sympathetic overseer, writing to the Voice of Industry in 1846, said that he had seen
girls faint in the morning in consequence of the air being so impure in the mill. This is quite a common thing, especially when girls have worked in the factory for a considerable length of time.
Over 100 years later, workers would continue to complain about the same unhealthy and dangerous conditions in cotton textile mills that existed in the 1800s. The New York Times reported one such account in a 1977 article quoting factory worker Flossie Strickland.
I just started to smother after I had been working in the spinning room for a few years. My work began to slow down. The boss man came around and told me that I wasn't moving fast enough. It was all that cotton dust flying around. I couldn't breathe. Finally, I had to quit work 5 years early. No pension, no medical compensation, not even one of those sheets we were making. Flossie Strickland.
Philip Foner, author of The Factory Girl, surmised that Flossie Strickland was probably a victim of brown lung, a mysterious and serious illness that was common among textile workers, which led to impaired lung capacity and resulted in outbursts of coughing and shortness of breath.
Our lives in danger, exposed to constant harm. The wheels tear the hand, pickers take off an arm. A handsome girl is caught in a cursed drum, dashed from things of sense into the world to come. Thomas Mann.
Accidents in the mills, often unreported, maimed and killed workers. Dangerous conditions added to the list of grievances that fueled protests and motivated the workers into combinations or unions, challenging the mill owners to improve conditions and safety within the factories.
Mary Kenyon has had the misfortune to lose the forefinger of the right hand. She was weaving on a power loom. She put her finger where it had no business, and so the loom in return snapped it off between the first and second joints. Joseph Hollingworth.
On Friday the 20th, a Miss Van Buren, a young lady of the Valety, was dressing her hair in the factory of Mr. Baldwin and accidentally brought it in contact with one of the horizontal iron shafts which makes 53 revolutions the minute. The scene was truly frightful. The whole head, temple, and forehead were peeled to the bone, the blood streaming from the small veins and arteries over her shoulders, and of those who have seen the protrusion of beautiful locks that formerly adorned her head, her first appearance impressed the idea of a headless trunk. She is at present in a comfortable condition, and her physicians state that every symptom indicates a firm reunion of the parts and a speedy recovery of health. The Dover Enquirer, 1833.
I'll neither spin nor weave on a Sunday morning. I'll go out walking in the morning dew. When the sun is rising, you will find me in the heather, walking on a hillside like I used to do. 5 o'clock, the wheels are spinning, flaxen, cotton, weaving, linen. All that metal makes a din, and I'll be glad to leave it. Fare thee well, the girls may weather when they're keeping time together, and they sing to one another, spinning and a-weaving. I'll neither spin nor weave on a Sunday morning. I'll go out walking in the morning dew. When the sun is rising, you will find me in the heather, walking on a hillside like I used to do. Working at these new machines, a way to earn a meager means, helps to put your bread and beans and butter on the table. Work the week out as you will, spinning cotton in the mill, fighting at the loom until they say the work is over. I'll neither spin nor weave on a Sunday morning. I'll go out walking in the morning dew. When the sun is rising, you will find me in the heather, walking on a hillside like I used to do. The weaver's wage, it is hard won. Monday, Tuesday, factories run. Wednesday, Thursday, work's not done, and Friday is no better. Treadles shift as days pass by, bobbins spin and shuttles fly. Saturday, the end is nigh, for Sunday's around the corner. I'll neither spin nor weave on a Sunday morning. I'll go out walking in the morning dew. When the sun is rising, you will find me in the heather, walking on a hillside like I used to do. I'll neither spin nor weave on a Sunday morning. I'll go out walking in the morning dew. When the sun is rising, you will find me in the heather, walking on a hillside like I used to do.
Mill work, although dangerous and tedious, provided women the opportunity to expand into the wage work arena and participate in the acquisition and management of the extremely valuable resource, money. The women quickly determined that money was a means to independence and a new sense of self-esteem and accomplishment.
Everything I've read referred a lot to the money. I guess it was quite good for the times. The fact that they were able to save and made them more eligible to participate more freely in society, I guess. To join things, to pay membership fees if they did want to use a circulating library. Those stores downtown changed from just providing material where you could make your own dresses to actually finished goods. The girls could go and buy completely finished dresses and bonnets and parasols and things I've read said they really loved to do that. They would go downtown and get gussied up, and they used to dress up for going to theater and things like that. I think they liked having spending money. Clearly it was something that had never happened to any other generation before theirs.
No matter how long the workday or how exhausted the women were, they found time for self-improvement. They read and traded books. The Dover Lyceum was constructed early in the 1800s to promote general education. Guest speakers would often visit, and the women would attend to listen in on the important topics of the day. The boarding house system was what made it possible for the early factories to run large-scale operations. The boarding house was perfect for socialization. Women from many different parts of the surrounding areas were able to interact and discuss their different ideas. The women pooled their resources and subscribed to daily papers, religious publications, and other periodicals. Dover established circulating libraries. The women took seriously the quest for information and the debate of ideas, including abolition, fashion, and cures of various types. The women would often spend long hours discussing and debating important issues, including their wages, working conditions, and plans for strikes. The Cocheco Manufacturing Company rules specifically prohibited combinations and strikes, and yet Dover, New Hampshire would be the major seat of labor unrest and strikes from 1828 on. The boarding houses would serve as the communication and organizational center for all such activities. The women came by the hundreds and by the thousands, year after year, to work the long hours, live by strict rules, and dare the danger of accidents and illnesses festering in the mills. They came for the opportunities which the mills offered, but they would not, could not yield their dignity or their rights. They criticized the factory system. They acted in collective protest in an effort to protect their jobs, their wages, and their health. The substantial number of strikes in the 1820s, 1830s, and 1840s by both men and women factory workers clearly indicate that the early decades of the mechanized factory system in Dover and New England were not a golden age that simply fell into decline. Protest and action led to the creation of institutions called labor reform associations, focused on collective long-term change throughout the 1840s for all the factory workers. The women of Dover would once again lead the way in the formation of combinations or reform associations. In 1834, the Cocheco Manufacturing Company's regulations forbade any combination whereby the work may be impeded or the company's interest in any way injured. Operatives who engaged in any such combination lost wages due to them. In protest, complaining they were treated more like slaves than respected and valued workers, the women mill workers of Dover, New Hampshire, Newmarket, New Hampshire, and Lowell, Massachusetts, would walk out again in the largest concerted strike to date, composed of thousands of women workers. The women withdrew their money from the local banks in protest, and the strikes would last 4 weeks. In Dover, most of the women would return to work with nothing changed after 14 days. Except those participants and leaders who were blacklisted from any work in any mills. More often than not, the women protested against reduced wages, but the long hours and the unsafe conditions would continue to fuel their determination to improve not only their position and their interests, but future generations as well. The women defended themselves against the abuses of the factory system. The road to improvement and respect would be long and hard, but the light of subtle revolution had been set in motion, and there would be no turning back. The lighting up had begun. The New Hampshire State Legislature was the first in the country to enact a law regulating the hours of labor in manufactories to 10 hours per day. The law would not provide for penalties, and it would allow manufacturers to create special contracts requiring the workers to work as long as the mills operated. Those refusing to sign the special contracts were dismissed and blacklisted. They would find no work in any factories in the area. It would take many more years of protest, organization, and legislative efforts to establish fair wages, improve the health and safety conditions in the mills, and establish reasonable hours for labor. Persistent in their efforts, the women mill workers would continue to fight for change and reform. And in 1847, the women workers of Dover, New Hampshire, and Nashua, New Hampshire, would turn out in protest of the lighting up.
The factories shall not light up at present. The girls turned out at Dover and refused to light up also at Nashua, New Hampshire. John Haynes, September 22nd, 1847.